I'm sure you will all forgive me that I know much less about this than everybody else who spoke, so I have twice as long to explain what I don't know. This is always how it is. For me, this has been a sort of journey of exploration, and I'm probably going to tell you things you know or that are outrageously wrong. I can only apologize and blame the organizers. But I found it extremely interesting for myself, and it's taught me quite a lot, not only about Iceland, but also what's going on elsewhere. I'm going to start with this lovely picture. This is where you were a few years ago. It's the drawing I most like that I've discovered about the crisis. It is, of course, the scream on Wall Street. The scream, as of course you know, is a very great picture by the Norwegian painter Munch, not the most cheerful of all artists, but one of the most profound and penetrating. And I thought this particular graphic artist, and I have no idea who it is, I found it on the web, got pretty perfectly the scale of the experience, and it must have been pretty exciting here at that time. In my remarks, I'm going to focus on 4 questions which really just follow the questions I was asked. First, which is actually going to be the largest part, assessing the nature of the recovery, which is going to be rather backward-looking, but I can't say that much about the future. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about policy for the short run, and then about policy for the long run. And then I was asked a few very provocative policy questions, and I'm going to give very provocative answers, and that was, I hope, trigger the answers. In trying to put together this presentation, I thought it would be interesting to compare Iceland with the crisis-hit Eurozone member countries, partly because there is interesting comparative data, and partly because it would give me some sense of what's happened here. In terms of GDP, and I'll come in a moment to the comment about how you should value GDP, should you value it in somebody else's currency? I can't see for the life of me why you would want to do so, since you don't consume in that currency. But it actually looks pretty good compared to the other countries I'm going to show you. Not startlingly good, but really pretty good, particularly given the scale of the financial crisis you end up, the size of the banking sector you started in with, and the scale of the run you experienced, which was quite extraordinary. I attribute this to the benefits of the devaluation, relatively swift action on the banking sector, and at least some initial efforts to tackle the debt overhang. As I will show you, Iceland has emerged with what seems to be, and the statistics I use throughout are IMF statistics. They're the best comparative statistics, I think, and they're very recent, with relatively modest net public debt and a good external balance. And I think that's really not at all bad. I start off with this, which actually doesn't come from the IMF. It comes from the OECD statistics as reinterpreted by the Conference Board. So this is the real GDP per head of the 5 countries I'm going to focus on, Greece, Iceland, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain. And since 2000. I think I found this quite fascinating. I really didn't know anything about where it was. First, obviously, Iceland is a seriously rich country. So I'm afraid I don't feel quite as sorry for you as I did before I came. What is this fuss about a country that was incredibly rich, which is now merely very rich? But never mind. I know people really care about where they were before. It's called the endowment effect in contemporary economics. So here we have these 5 countries. I know GDP is a bit problematic because Ireland in particular, not few I think, has this gigantic difference in GDP and GMP. So Ireland's GDP really exaggerates its real incomes. And if you allow for that, actually, it's not been very far from Iceland. And what you can see here is you had a great big wonderful boom. And this peaked in 2008, and the last data are for 2010, since it's a whole year data. And you obviously had a pretty steep decline, and at the end of this you've ended more or less with Ireland, which means Ireland is now much poorer than you in terms of real GMP, and you're of course way ahead of the others. But you have lost, and that becomes obvious in the next chart, you've lost really a pretty large chunk of the real income real GDP, sorry, per head, real GDP, I do understand the difference, that you gained during the 2000s. So you've lost slightly more than half of what you gained in real GDP. Now, this is a chart which might surprise you, not that this is, of course, anything to do with Iceland, that you probably don't realize that of these 5 countries, if you start in 2000, the country that is far and away done the best is Greece. Now, this merely tells you that Greece has got a lot further to go before it's through this. Ireland is beginning to stabilize, and I think that's already obvious in the 2009-10 figures. And your decline has slowed a great deal. But that's where you are relative to those crisis countries, again, clearly well above the 2000 starting point, but you've lost a lot in recent years. Now, let's look at the annual growth rates of these countries through the crisis years, from 2007 through to 2012. Greece, Iceland, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain. Iceland had, with Ireland, the deepest recessions in 2009, followed by a pretty deep recession in 2010. But Iceland has clearly come out of it earlier and with higher growth than in the other cases. Not very high growth. I think you're quite right to feel it's disappointing. But Iceland had this very deep collapse, but has come out of it earlier. Indeed, Ireland looks at the moment to be the only other one of those countries which has any serious chance of coming out of its crisis period during the period up to 2012. I don't think either Spain or Greece, Portugal, or Greece and Portugal are already not expected to, and Spain won't either. So in that sense, the natural comparator is actually Ireland, which in any case had much the same sort of crisis, namely a massive financial meltdown. Here I just look at it, the same thing by the years, so it becomes easier to compare. And you can see the match between Iceland and Ireland in 2009 is very close. In 2010, you were worse than Ireland, then better. You're paralleling Ireland really remarkably closely through this crisis. Now let's look at the performance in some of the areas which has already been discussed, where we can know things have gone relatively well. I think the fiscal performance is really rather remarkable, given the scale of the financial crisis and given the parallel with Ireland in the sort of financial crisis you had, and the cost that imposed on Ireland. In 2010, Ireland's fiscal deficit was 32% of GDP, almost entirely to recapitalize the banks. A very large part of that was to recapitalize the banks. You seem to have avoided a comparable meltdown in the fiscal situation as a result of that. I think that's quite an achievement. And the fiscal position, though not absolutely rock solid in terms of fiscal deficits, is looking to move towards a pretty satisfactory one by in 2011, this year and next year. Much more satisfactory than any other of these cases. So I think the fiscal record is remarkable and the comparison with Ireland quite encouraging. In terms of structural fiscal deficits, it looks much the same, possibly a little bit better. I think it's quite remarkable that the peak structural fiscal deficit in a crisis of this scale was only about 7% of GDP. I think that is really quite remarkable. And you look at Greece, you look at Ireland, these are bloodbaths fiscally, absolutely horrendous stories. And that shows itself in this, which I found quite particularly interesting. This is the net public debt of crisis-hit countries according to IMF data. This doesn't include all relevant assets. These are internationally comparable statistics. They're difficult often to interpret. But the basic story you get out of this is that given the scale of the crisis, again, the public finances in Iceland, compare it with Ireland, which started more or less in exactly the same position as you started in terms of net public debt, and Ireland is now expected to get stuck way over 100% of GDP in net public debt. You're on almost half that level. Portugal is just getting worse. Greece is a catastrophe, as you can see, which is why everybody expects it to be to default, the first European country to default for a very, very long time. Spain is closest to you, but I think that also is quite a remarkable performance. And in addition, the story we get on the current account is here Ireland has done well. It's one of the reasons that Ireland, I think, is beginning to grow out of this crisis, which is commendable. There they match you, but you had this unbelievably large current account deficit in 2008, and that seems to have melted away. There's nothing in what I've seen that suggests it's not sustainable. We may discuss this further, but I think the external balance performance and the fiscal performance of Iceland, given the scale of the crisis and the scale of the GDP falls, were really rather commendable and gives the basis of macroeconomic stability for the future. That's not enough for growth, but it's really very, very important. Now, obviously, the big difference between you and the other guys is you had a huge devaluation, as has been pointed out. That lowers your GDP and national income the GDP in foreign currency. I think the qualification here is important. As a result of this, your inflation is going to be relatively high. It's almost inevitable. The other countries are going to experience inflation at incredibly low levels, or more plausibly deflation, over a very long period. And therefore, we're in a disequilibrium situation, and I would expect the nominal GDP divergences, which have been discussed, to converge again over the next 10 years or so. Indeed, they have to, if those countries in the Eurozone are to recover, because they're seriously uncompetitive. That's least true for Ireland, but it's very, very true for Portugal, Spain, and Greece. And this is reflected, of course, in the fact that since the crisis began, already your price level has risen very, very massively. This is the current shift in consumer prices compared to those other countries you devalued. And a very big issue for Iceland, obviously, is whether the real exchange rate depreciation you've had, which I think was helpful in the adjustment process, can be sustained. Nobody's talked about future inflation performance, but I think that's quite a big issue for maintaining the stability that has been achieved. So what it seems to me to be the case is that Iceland has had a reasonably good stabilization story, and in some ways really remarkably good, particularly on fiscal and current account story, compared with its peers in Europe, and I think that's very commendable. There's a real issue about maintaining the competitiveness on the real exchange rate, particularly, as the economy starts to grow and recover, and that raises, I think, some very big questions about wage policy. Wage indexation has already been discussed. That's a pretty important issue if you want to maintain a competitiveness advantage from a devaluation. Now, let me now move to policy for the short run. As has already been mentioned, I've come to essentially the same conclusion. If you're looking at standard macroeconomic policy, fiscal or monetary policy, there's obviously very little room for maneuver here. There's been a real achievement in returning to stability on these policy areas, fiscal and monetary. You clearly don't want to have a huge inflation spike. You don't want to risk a currency collapse, particularly when you eliminate exchange controls. So I think you have to be pretty careful in those areas. The thing that I've thought was worth stressing, and it comes out of what I've read, and I think others have mentioned, is the very great importance of accelerating debt reduction, particularly in the household sector, where the levels that have been left for many house debtors seem to be very, very high, and that's likely to constrain consumption, which in any economy, even a small open one, is very, very important. Now, I just have a few things to say, and these are very broad. Actually, the other speakers obviously know so much more about this than I do, about policy for the long run. It does actually overlap. You have to start by defining, and that was, I think, what was said by the previous speaker, a small country like this, looking to the future, has to define in a very rigorous and precise way the nature of its competitive advantages, what makes it unique and special. And in Iceland's case, what makes it unique and special are its resources, which includes, of course, its location, which has been discussed, its energy richness, its marine resources, its possibilities as a maritime nation, its access to the Arctic. And you, since you have a small population and lots of resources, there's no good reason why you shouldn't be sensationally rich. And you ought to be, you're already very rich, you should be sensationally rich. That is obviously true, because that's what's going to happen. I would just underline the crucial point that was made there. This is a point I've made in many columns of mine. We are moving into an area where into a time when natural resources are ineluctably becoming scarcer because of the nature of the global development process. Not only are there far more human beings, but the countries with lots of those human beings are growing very, very fast in a highly labor and capital intensive manner, and they want resource-based products of every conceivable kind. They want to consume them in the form of tourism. They want to import them. China and India are really big factors in shifting the whole global demand for resources. And you're one of those lucky countries that's sitting on lots of it. So this is really good stuff. And it is the core, I think, of defining long-term competitive advantage for a country like this. Skilled labour has already been mentioned, absolutely central in generating employment. Ireland, of course, has made an enormous amount out of its haven status. Essentially, it's a tax arbitrage machine. I try to advise countries not to make that the basis of their competitive advantage, but some of them do it, and Switzerland's done pretty well out of that, so I can't really complain. But you can think about haven status as well. You could think of that almost as a sort of resource. And policy has to differentiate rigorously among these options. But if you're going to go for resources and use them efficiently, you really need long-run plans. You need to evaluate the resource options carefully. You need to make sure that exploration and development contracts operate on a competitive basis and nobody takes you to the cleaner. You need to ensure that the rent is extracted for the benefit of Iceland and not the people who are investing in Iceland. Really quite important, not always done. And you need to ensure appropriate measures of risk and return sharing between this country and the investors. Obviously on skilled labour, very high quality education, need to encourage inward foreign direct investment of precisely the sorts of companies that can use this sort of labour efficiently. I don't have much to say on haven status. I'm going to finish very clearly because I really don't like it, but it can work for a small economy. You've got to be careful about international reactions, and it's very important to ensure that offshore activities do not taint the domestic economy. So I would very strongly underline the suggestion that domestic retail banking should be separated from investment banking, which it just so happens is the principal recommendation of the UK's Independent Commission of Banking, of which I was a member. If we want people to run around the world on doing investment banking, we do not want to subsidize them, and we do not want them to destroy our economy. If they destroy somebody else's economy, it's somebody else's problem. So, and that's the view I've taken of these wonderful industries, and I think it's the view you should take too. You should never allow people who are going to cause havoc in the rest of the world to cause havoc for you too. That's a really serious mistake. Finally, very briefly, incredibly briefly, 5 policy questions are, how damaging are currency controls? I'm not that persuaded of the utter evil of currency controls, but let's have a discussion on that. But they obviously need to be eliminated in the medium term. What do I mean by the medium term? I mean no longer than 3 to 5 years. Should Iceland join the European Union? Why on earth would you want to join something as dysfunctional as the European Union? Have you been paying any attention to what's going on there? Iceland, of course, would have no influence on EU policies whatsoever. Its vote would count for zilch, and it could well end up losing control over its valuable resources because they will really want them. Can Iceland hold the smallest currency in the world? I don't see why not. I'm in favour of currencies. I'm in favour of their adjusting to its circumstances. I know this will make a very big difference to the previous speaker. But there's a very simple rule. If you're going to adopt somebody else's currencies, currency and you're subject to different shocks from that currency with which you're adopting it, you need a very, very flexible domestic economy. This happened to be the mistake, the thing that all the people who joined the Eurozone, and essentially everybody who joined the Eurozone was joining somebody else's currency, unless they're Germany. Because it's Germany's currency, in case anybody hadn't noticed. Now, so everybody else was joining somebody else's currency, so you have to live with that way that currency moves. And if you have no choice of it, that means basically domestic labor price flexibility. You give up the exchange rate, you have to be able to live in a world where nominal wages can collapse. Ireland is the only Eurozone country that is getting close to managing that. Don't do it unless you can do it. That's really what this consumer price indexing story is about. And the way that happens is by making lots of people unemployed, and you don't seem to like that very much. Is the Scandinavian model viable? Ultimately, it depends on whether Icelanders would leave or cease to work rather than pay high taxes. At present levels, Iceland's taxes are not out of line with current Scandinavian taxes. They're not at Scandinavian, Swedish levels of the early 1990s. And since the 1990s, when Sweden cut its taxes somewhat and its spending somewhat, Sweden's been doing fine. But you really have to ask whether Icelanders are the sort of people that are going to be prepared to pay those taxes or not. Swedes seem to be willing to pay quite a lot of taxes, and Danes even more, and they do fine. I don't know where you fall into this. Can Ireland choose, final question, can Iceland choose not to pay for IceSave, I was asked. Well, my position on this is very, very clear. Of course, morally, it should not have to do so because everybody who invested in this idiotic bank in Britain was a fool, and the government was a fool for bailing them out afterwards. So it's our problem, not your problem. You just did what people should do with foreigners in your financial sector. You screwed them, because that's what financial sectors do. I have no understanding anymore of the legal situation, and I think the final decision on what Iceland does should be left until you see how much it's actually going to cost. It appears that much of the money, almost all the money, is going to come back from the estate of the bank anyway, in which case taking a position of principle on this doesn't strike me as very sensible. So just leave it and see what happens. So those are my very, very quick thoughts in 23 minutes on Iceland. I apologize for every mistake and political folly I have committed in my remarks, but I did enjoy this little exploration of this quite remarkable case. The big conclusion I draw from this is you are seriously lucky people. You live in an incredibly rich country. You've succeeded in screwing up the financial system quite impressively, and you're still very rich. So I'm afraid I feel much less sorry for you than I did before. But I wish you every success in future, and we're now going to discuss how that's going to happen.